Hello. Today we have Class 5, Defense and Definition, the Early Apologists. We're going to get to look at quite a bit of early Christian material this time, which I am looking forward to. And then next week we get Irenaeus of Lyon, our first great theologian, who was our first great theologian. More about him later. To begin with, apologetics, apologetic literature, comes from the Greek word, as Hall tells us, comes from the Greek word for explanation. As he points out, the most famous apology of all times, I think, is the Apology of Socrates, which we get twice, once from Xenophon, once from Plato, uh, which was the speech that Socrates gave at his own trial, at which he was finally condemned and afterwards executed. So he was not saying that he was sorry. As a matter of fact, he gave an initial speech arguing that what he was doing was good, not bad. And then when he was condemned by the jury, there was another phase of the trial when the same jury would decide what your punishment should be. And most people expected that Socrates, who was generally regarded as a kook, as academics always are, but had been a war hero and other things, they thought that he would argue for exile and that then the jury would let him go. Socrates instead argued that since what he'd actually been doing was a good thing, that he should be supported by the city government for the rest of his life, as a sign of their gratitude for his good deeds. And that was the that was the part of the speech that got him executed. But anyway, it was an explanation and defense, really more explanation. A speaking forth, apo, from, and a logos, speech. It's when you speak out on your own behalf. That's what an apology is. So apologetic literature is not works in which Christians say, oh, gee, we're so sorry, we're all going to go back and be pagans, but rather works in which Christians try to explain the validity and value of what they're doing and argue, certainly in the ancient context, argue that they shouldn't be punished for it, because by the time these works begin to appear, Christians are being punished for being Christian, which was already recognized generally as being against the law. Okay. To begin with, I have sent you, along with the announcement that this lecture is available, a list of Christian apologies from the early church. This includes more than are mentioned in his chapter, because he's taking just the very few at the beginning. This is certainly not a complete list. This is I just looked through my shelves, and these are the ones that I found. There are lots more. There certainly were lots more, and I believe that there still are lots more from the early Christian period, because apologetics is something that Christians have widely done. I would argue, as a matter of fact, that a very large part of Christian literature of all periods is apologetic. Every age, the gospel is not of the world. The gospel is in the world. And every age requires that the gospel be explained to it in different ways, depending on what the particular things going on in that part of the world are at the time that the Christians are living there. I would argue, for example, that the beginning of, that all of the basic systematic theology books and a lot of the basic, even catechetical books that we use begin at least with apologetic sections. On the top shelf behind me, all the way on over this shoulder, the white things up there are Aquinas's Summa contra Gentiles, Summa against the nations, which will look very familiar if you look at this list, and he's not doing that by chance. That's all on purpose. That was a summary of Christian theology designed to be produced in a short compass, so that people who were trying to re-evangelize, especially the southern parts of France, from the Cathars, in the Middle Ages would be able, that the Dominicans would be able to carry that around with them. It is an explicitly apologetic work. Our systematic theological text that we have chosen to teach people is an explicitly apologetic work. I would argue that every confirmation class needs to be at least partly, if not virtually all, couched in an apologetic mode, because people need to be instructed in Christianity. I would argue that most Christian preaching, even to well-instructed congregations, needs to be apologetic, because we live in an age which is very hostile to and separated from the Christian life and the Christian past, and they need to have those things explained to them. Even if they are fully sacramentally involved Christians living good lives, that doesn't mean that they don't need to have baptism explained to them. I mean, if you do a baptism and read that, we talked about that before, right? If you do baptism and read that service with all of the, renouncing the world, the flesh, and the devil stuff, you need to explain that to people for them not to think it's weird, something we do just because we do it, or offensive. It's neither of those things, but it's not of our age, and it needs to be explained. It needs an apology. Okay. Perhaps we'll look more at that list as we go along. Let's just look briefly at the kinds of things that that Hall begins with. Justin the Martyr, who is one of the most prolific, wrote the most of very early Christian authors, wrote 3 works that we have: 2 apologies, first apology, second apology, called So by Us, and a dialogue with a Jew named Trypho, which is of course also an apologetic work. He's arguing with Trypho. Trypho argues that if Christians really understood the Bible, they would be Jews, and Justin argues that if Jews really understood the Bible, they would be Christians. That's a doubly apologetic work. Both sides are trying to explain what they think is right and argue for its truth. I did not include the dialogue with Trypho on the list because I thought that arguments with Judaism were, well, first of all, generally off topic for the kinds of things in Hall's chapter, but also were more particular than a general claim that Christians are not cannibals, which is one of the basic points a lot of early apologists want to make. So, one of the first things to see in this literature is that what is contained in apologetic literature is very strictly controlled, not so much by the author as by the audience, by the author's understanding of the audience. Right? If you are trying to argue for the validity of something, what you talk about depends directly on what you think the audience does not think is valid. Right? If you are trying to argue, for example, if you are trying to argue with there aren't polite terms for these things, and I don't mean to upset anybody, but with, say, an aggressive modern secular feminist woman, right, for the desirability of Christian marriage, if you want to argue with her about that, you would talk, one of the things I think you would be smart to bring up would be the fact that Christian marriage takes women very seriously as individual people with their own lives and value, and is intended to be a place in which they can live their lives fully and freely to be the kind of people that they would like to be, which I believe is absolutely true, and also is attractive to, I would think, to, if you can get the axe out of her hands, is attractive to, an aggressive feminist audience. Now, if you're talking to a very traditional Jew, right, who would, say an Orthodox Jew who is living in a very different world, then you would argue that, that Christian marriage is based very deeply in the Old Testament scriptures, which it certainly is, and that it continues a living tradition that goes all the way back to then, which it certainly does, and that it is certainly infused with, and we would say transformed by, a Christian understanding, but that it's a Christian understanding of the same thing, we would argue, that Jews were doing before and that Jews still do now. It's an attempt to try to create a relationship in which God can be loved and worshiped in the context of a married couple, and in which a married couple can work together to try to live a good religious life in the sight of God. I believe that both of those arguments, both of those apologies, right, the one to the feminist and the one to the religious Jew, are both completely accurate, but you can see that they almost completely do not overlap, right? That's not because the person making those arguments would be dishonest, but rather because the person would be trying to offer to the audience something that the speaker thinks the audience would be likely to accept as being a good thing, right? That is very important. You cannot take apologetic literature and slap it down and say, this is early Christian thought, because that's just not true. It's not even the thought, the religious understanding of the people, of the individual people who are writing. These are very particular presentations written for particular audiences and with particular intentions, and all of that must be considered in order for them to be properly understood. That is not to say that they do not include tremendously important evidence of early Christian thought and practice, because they do. But you need to understand how they are being produced. For example, here let's just go through. I don't want to get out of order with Hall. Let me say let me say this now. One of the interesting things about this literature, from my point of view, is that a number of these works contain the longest and most explicit explanations of Christian worship practice that survive. We've talked about this before. There were no early Christian worship books. It was considered sacrilegious to share the secrets of the church with those outside the church. So things were not written down. There was no invite a friend to church Sunday, right? You keep your friends out until they're baptized. There was a very carefully considered process of gradually introducing people to Christian teaching and practice. All of these things are part of the understanding that the secrets of the church are sacred and they need to be guarded in the same way that we guard the consecrated host. We don't kind of leave it lying around. We keep it in special places, and if it's there, we light a light so we know it's there. So we're reminded of that fact, and everyone else is aware of that too. The secrets of the church were treated that way. So the first question you need to ask is, if, as we know is the case, the early church would not explain or describe its worship rites to people who were being prepared for baptism until right before they were baptized, or even sometimes until after they were baptized, during the first time that they were participating. if that is true, and we know it was, why are there even very general descriptions and explanations of what Christians did in worship with the doors shut and the world kept out? And the answer is very clearly that some of the most pernicious accusations made against the church were aimed directly at what Christians were thought to do when they gathered together for worship and shut the doors, right? I've talked of these things before, but it's very important for us to understand. In our culture, Christians are considered to be, well, of course, always hypocritical and bad, but also unimaginative and dull. And the really fun people are the Hollywood stars who are taking drugs and dying on the sidewalk outside the Viper Room. Those are the really hip people. Christians are dull because they don't do that kind of stuff, right? So in our culture, we don't generally tend to accuse, say, Roman Catholics of engaging in orgiastic sex at morning mass. But in the ancient world, where temples were open and where people though we've talked about the fact that a lot of things in paganism were secret, but still there were larger groups, and men could go in one place and women in another and stuff. The idea of men and women together, not related, going into a closed room and doing something was more than suspicious in their culture, as it still is now in the modern Middle East. And you should know that orgiastic sex, cannibalism, stealing and sacrificing of infant children and then eating them, these are all things that ISIS is still now accusing Christians of in the Middle East and killing them for doing, even though they're not doing it. And these are accusations that go all the way back to the very beginning. These are the kinds of accusations against which the apologists are trying to write. And this is why they describe, to some degree, what they were doing in worship, because they want to make clear. They say, you see this over and over again. We get together, we sing hymns, we say prayers, we read the memoirs of the disciples, we teach and preach, we eat and drink regular bread and regular wine, they say, because it's not human flesh and blood from babies they've stolen in the night. It's bread and wine, and they don't go into the whole sacramental thing because you're not allowed to talk to people outside. They say, it's bread and wine, right? Because these are things that those are the things that they think will make them sound like a real religious group instead of like a weird sadistic horror show, which is what they were accused of being. Okay. Over and over again, here at the bottom of page 49, the apologists argue that Christianity teaches people to be good citizens, not bad citizens, to be loyal subjects of the emperor, not rebels. And they argue that that the kind of behavior that the government doesn't like, theft, adultery, murder, are the kinds of things that the church teaches people not to do. Right? You get some citations here on page 50 in the top half for places where you can see that the Christians are denying that they eat babies and stuff. I didn't put those on our reading list to look at now because, first of all, I thought you're much more likely to go. I've taught enough to think that those are the kinds of things that people will read on their own time, and we're going to look for other stuff. I never had any trouble getting undergraduates to read the cannibalism, orgiastic sex passages. That was, they were passing those around and photocopying them to send them home. But it's the doctrine that is always hard to get people to do. So that's what we're going to look at. Okay. Because the goal, the first goal because the church is already under pressure at the time these people write. So the first goal, even before a desire to make converts, is a desire to try to ease the pressure on the church, right? More important, because more immediate, than trying to get people interested in seeing why it would be good to be a member of this group. What the authors are trying to get people to see that this is a group we can safely leave alone. And so both those who argue with pagans and those who argue with Jews try to stress very clearly and in great detail the similarities and congruences between what the pagan people are doing and the Christian people and what the Jewish people are doing and the Christian people. And of course, those connections and congruences are going to be quite different, right? The first thing you see is that the connections between pagan living and Christian living are going to be in the general moral category. We teach our kids not to steal. You teach your kids not to steal. We teach our husbands and wives not to commit adultery. You do the same with yours. And the other thing is that they, in terms of doctrine and thought, they mostly go directly to what we would call philosophy rather than what we would call religion. Right? We've said enough about paganism up to this point for you to realize that actual pagan religious practice, as it existed in the classical world, really offered nothing for the church to work with. The church was trying to repudiate all of that, the basic ideas and the things that people did, whereas philosophy had a great deal of similarity with a lot of basic Christian doctrine in the same way it does with a lot of biblical doctrine. And so it's in philosophic terms that they try to make a connection on the level of thought, right? So ethics and philosophy are the ways that they try to draw connections. They don't say, when you're killing your goats, you're wishing for good things for your family, just like we do when we say the Lord's Prayer. They don't, because it's so different that doesn't, there's not a single passage in this literature that ever says anything like that. And that's just not an argument that occurs to anybody. Okay. You will notice that the process of taking someone like Socrates, who was, as the records have it, an intensely moral individual who did not actually preach or teach rebellion against the state, and believed in a single divine being and was trying to mold his will to the will of that divine being, and was killed by the city, by the civil government under which he lived, that the attempts to make parallels between Socrates in those ways and what's happening to Christians begin very, very early. And they continue up to the present day. Socrates has been a very important figure in Christian apologetics in the West from the very beginning. You'll notice if you look at something like Dante, Socrates is an important figure in Dante for all of these reasons. It allows, as we're going to see, he is one of the people who allow the apologists to make connections, sophisticated connections that will appeal to educated people over the boundary between Christianity and pagan philosophical life. Okay. One of the things to notice here, beginning on page 52, God and His Word. It certainly is true that apologetic literature, generally speaking, is binitarian. In other words, it talks about God the Father and it talks about Jesus Christ. Some of this is obvious instructional simplification, right? If you sit down with a confirmation class, you don't say, well, Christians believe that God is three in one, so the first thing we need to do is we need to spend 6 weeks on essence, 6 weeks on substance and 6 weeks on what is a person. So that'll be 18 weeks, and then we'll be able to come back and we'll talk about in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, right? Because you'll empty the room, and there will, and so you will completely defeat your purpose. In other words, if you offer things on too high a level to people, you short circuit the process that you're trying to follow along. So nobody's going to slap down a fully developed Trinitarian theological statement, even so far as they had developed up to this point, which, as far as we can tell, because this is the stuff we have to read, is not very far. As Hall says, it's perfectly clear that when they use what we would call creedal formulae, beginning here on pages 54 and 55, when the apologists are talking in terms of statements of belief, or when they're sort of alluding to prayer and worship, then things very quickly become Trinitarian. It's very easy for us to see, looking back, that the form and language of this is very early. This is the 100s mostly, the second century. The form and the language of even second century Christianity is already heavily and naturally and inescapably Trinitarian. And that comes out when they sort of talk about what they say. But you're not going to get statements, Trinitarian statements in this kind of language, again, for two reasons. One, there are not written worship services, there are not written prayers. So then, if they wanted to copy that stuff into these works, which they wouldn't, which they don't, there isn't anything to copy. And the other thing is that would be too much of laying the secrets, the sacred secrets of the church before the pagan population, and the Christians would just never do that. So it's actually quite surprising, and I would have to think made a lot of early Christians, at least however many were aware of this literature, made a lot of them quite uncomfortable that we have as much of this kind of language as we do, because this is really getting very close to putting cards on the table, which is something that early Christians did not want to do for a whole lot of reasons that we've already talked about. The binitarianism is very understandable for a couple of reasons. To begin with, the main thrust of the gospel, of course, is the offering of Christ crucified to the world. So you've got to talk about Jesus, right? If you're going to try to explain anything about Jesus, you've also got, of course, to talk about God the Father, because Jesus is who he is because of his relationship to God the Father. So you have to talk about Jesus because he's what you're talking about, and you have to talk about God the Father because he's who makes Jesus what he is. So you've got two automatically. The intellectual problem, as we will see when we start to look at original sources, the intellectual problem for pagans and for people joining the very early church is, how can you use divine language of Jesus and use divine language of God the Father and say you only believe in one God? That's the basic problem. The Holy Ghost, of course, is not going to make this easier, right? It's going to make it more complicated, but it's not going to change the problem. Right? The basic problem is, how can you have two and say you have one? Right? Just as a note, the first treatise that comes to us from the church, which probably not by the author but by people quite soon after, is called On the Trinity, De Trinitate. It was written by Novatian, a Roman presbyter who gets into trouble and splits from the church, and his work is so important that it's passed down and known in both Greek and Latin, which is very rare for a Latin language work, and read up until the present day. And it was, sort of in the Renaissance period, recognized that this was actually by Novatian, not by someone else, which is how it gets around everybody. It passed down under several different names, usually Tertullian, but in the West and in the East, different people. Even though it's called On the Trinity, so it's about sort of the natures of God and stuff, it's essentially a binitarian work. It's really a work in which Novation tries to demonstrate from Scripture that God the Son is fully divine. And so Christ, as God the Son incarnate, is a fully divine being incarnate. That's what De Trinitate is about. It's really, from our modern systematic point of view, a Christological work rather than a Trinitarian work. And that's a good thing to remember, because and Novation writes he writes that probably in the 240s, right? And which is 100 years after Justin Martyr, right? And this is a lot later, but still, when Christians want to talk about theology, what they really want to do is talk about Jesus, right? As we've said before, the early church is very evangelical, which is why modern American evangelicals are getting more and more interested in the early church. For several hundred years, they stayed away from it, thinking, ooh, those are just dead Catholics. And now they're beginning to realize, wait a sec, those are our brothers in Christ. And they're getting more and more interested. And so that places like Baylor are hiring, early Christian specialists, very good ones, as a matter of fact. And they're publishing early Christian works and stuff, which I, for one, think is a great thing. So what we see in this God and the Word, here on pages 52 through 54, is the different works here that are trying to talk in intelligent ways about the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. And generally speaking, they do this by speaking of the Son as the Word, of course encouraged by the Gospel of John, but also encouraged by the fact that logos, word in Greek, which is the language most of these people are writing in, is a very familiar and respectable philosophical term, and that since philosophy would say there is really one God and he is rational, or in Greek, logikos, right? If you talk about God, theos, and logos, theology, right, the two words in theology, if you talk about God and Word, then you're on the right page to talk to people who think about these kinds of things in Greek culture. And that's why that's one of the basic reasons also why they use word, is because it's a word that has positive resonances with their audience. We have no idea how these people, these same authors, talked when they were in church on Sunday with other Christians if they were speaking about Father and Son. They may well have been talking about him as Son primarily instead of Word, because of course Son is more common in the New Testament than Word is. But when you go talk to the non-Christian public, Son is a real problem, because all the Greek gods have children, but that's not the kind of thing you're trying to, we don't want everyone thinking Leda and the swan, right? Where Zeus becomes a swan and has sex with Leda, and then she has, semi-divine children. That's not the picture that you're trying to put forward of what the church is believing. So you stay away from Son, because that's a real hot potato, but Word is much more attractive in a lot of ways as an apologetic way of talking about who you think Jesus is. Right? Okay. It's Word is obviously spiritual in the sense that it's non-physical, and Son requires a lot more work to get it back to being thought of on a spiritual level. So if you're just trying to start up with somebody, you don't make problems for yourself that you don't have to have. Okay. We've already talked a little about the Holy Spirit and Trinity. And I really like, one of the things I really like in this chapter are these 4 points here on page 55. One of the great difficulties that modern, both experts in Christian thought and also Christian lay people have, is listening to the way the early church speaks about Jesus, oftentimes in the context of angels. We have a much more fully developed and stratified picture of the heavenly hosts. And angels are on a lower, they're less than divine level in our imagination. And so calling Jesus an angel is a theological error of demotion. You're putting him below where you want him to be. Really, I should say not calling Jesus. Well, calling, Jesus an angel as God the Son incarnate. But first of all, at the time that these people write, things aren't that fully developed. And also, angel is a word that means messenger. Before it means spiritual being, it means messenger. The only It is not the case that the only angels in the Bible are these spiritual heavenly beings. Lots of people get sent places in the Bible, and they're all angels in the Greek Bible. When God the Father sends the Son is an angel. He's someone who is sent. That's one of the things that the church is saying. And so this is an acceptable word in a way that for us now, you get out your red pencil and you start marking if you're the teacher and that kind of word comes by. But that's a misunderstanding to read this material with that in mind. We need to understand that we are before the development of the kinds of sophisticated theological choices that we now have. And so to think that, these people haven't learned all the things we've learned, so they're making this mistake about Jesus, is wrong. Because at the time and place that they're using it, those words don't have the meanings that they would have if we use them now. I am not in any way suggesting that you go into your church and start talking about Jesus as an angel, because you will immediately and automatically confuse everyone. But we live in a different age. Preaching is apologetic. So when you preach, you have to understand where your audience is right then, not what worked 18 and a half centuries ago. Okay. I chose a number of different things for us to look at. Some of them I just want to sort of glance and show you something. Because there's so many different things to try to show you about the early church. And for example, number 33 that we're going to look at now, which is a quote from Eusebius' Church History. It's on page 65 in this book, where he's talking about Quadratus, an apologist whose work does not survive. I think Quadratus does not survive because, I want to show you what Eusebius is doing. To him, Quadratus dedicated and addressed a discourse, which he had composed in defense of our religion, because certain wicked men were endeavoring to molest our people, aimed at the truth. The treatise is still to be found in the hands of very many of the brethren, as indeed it is in ours also. In other words, I, Eusebius, have a copy. Just as a quick note, one of the reasons why Eusebius was able to produce such a massive library of stuff, including his church history, you'll notice that he's got 4 volumes of the preparation for the gospel and the proof of the gospel. His 2 main apologetic works, he wrote more than that, but these are the 2 main ones, are both 2-volume, dictionary-sized things. Was because the best Christian library in the ancient world was in Caesarea, where he was bishop on the coast of Palestine, near what's now Tel Aviv. Caesarea is gone, but Tel Aviv is a modern, sort of close-by city. Okay. From it we may gather striking proofs of the author's understanding and of his apostolic soundness in the faith. He himself reveals the early date at which he lived in the following account, and then he quotes, "The works of our Savior were always present, for after his departure as well, they lived for a considerable time, insomuch that some of them survived even to our own day." In other words, Quadratus says that he knew some people who had been healed by Jesus. Right? They were still around when he was writing. The reason I included this is I wanted to make clear to you to begin with, Eusebius is writing in the early 300s. First 30 years of the 300s, he's writing his church history. And when he picks up Quadratus, all he's got is the parchment in his hand. He's trying to figure out when Quadratus writes, and he does it the same way we would if we were trying to figure that out, by comments like this. Well, if there's still people around who were healed by Jesus, then he's got to be within a human lifetime of Jesus. So he's really very early. He's, 250 years before Eusebius' writing. Because we're looking at the early church, and all these people are early church Christians, sometimes it's clear that when you talk to people, sometimes they sort of imagine that all these people go to the same middle school, that everybody's at the same time and everybody knows everybody else, because it is a small group of people by our standards. But it's important to see that here we have a work which has been passed down a couple of centuries at least in the church, and Eusebius is talking about it. As Hall says, very soon after a lot of these apologies were written, they were no longer relevant, because once Christianity is legalized in the Roman Empire, 324 AD is the last date when Constantine takes over the East, and then everywhere in the Roman Empire Christianity is legalized. After that, this kind of apologetic work is of really only historical use. This argument that you should not be persecuting us. Some of the basic points, like, how you can try to get pagan people to think that Christianity is respectable and they might like to join, that kind of thing, those things continue, but they get expressed in very different contexts because the circumstances have changed so much. So it's not surprising, as Hall says, that a lot of this material disappears. We tend to have things either that survive by chance, like Justin Martyr. As Hall says, Justin Martyr survives only in a single manuscript, and actually the manuscript has since, luckily it was transcribed and printed, because the manuscript has been destroyed in the modern period. There was only one copy of Justin Martyr, 3 major works from the very early church that survived, and fortunately it survived long enough to be printed. But there are other things like Eusebius of Caesarea. His works survived because he was a standard author for Christian instruction from the very beginning, and because the Byzantines continued, for more than 1,000 years after he was gone, copying his works and using them in instruction, and so his stuff was widely preserved. Origen is very famous, and so his work, Contra Celsum, is, but a lot of this, Tertullian, of course, is a major, well, more on these people later, right? But some things survive because the authors are important, like John Chrysostom. Everybody loves John Chrysostom, and so his vast body of works tend to survive, partly because they're used in schools and partly because they're read for religious purposes by monastics all through history, and they're all being translated into English in the present day. There's everyone's always interested in Chrysostom. Just a what do they say? Full confession, is that what they say? Anyway, if we had had another son, he would have been named John after Chrysostom. So I have a lot more I could say about Chrysostom, but I won't. I'll spare you. And we'll go to number 35, conversion. This is Justin's dialogue with Trypho, which is the dialogue with the Jew. And I just wanted to include it because I wanted you to see how biblical here he's talking to a Jew, a non-Christian Jew, and to see how biblical his language is when he does that. All this beating, our swords into plowshares, our pikes into farming tools, all this kind of stuff. It's not the way apologists write when they write to pagans, because of course it wouldn't mean anything to pagans. They wouldn't know what you were doing. They wouldn't even know you were doing anything. If you ever, it's very funny to go to the what is it called? Not the League of Nations, the United Nations in New York, where they have, we'll beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, that quote. And it's carved right in the lobby, at least it was 50 years ago when I was there. It was carved right in the lobby where they take you for your tour. And I was less than 10, I think, when I went there. I already knew it was a Bible quote, and there were people who were sort of shocked that this very forward-looking organization, I don't know if anyone thinks that of the UN anymore, but in the 60s they did, this very forward-looking organization would have a Bible quote, so they all knew the thing by heart because it's this wonderful forward-looking thing, but they just assumed it was, good, not religious. So you can, if that's the case in our culture, you can imagine how useless it would be to fling Bible stuff around with a bunch of pagan philosophers, because that's just not something that they do. Okay. Justin Martyr, number 38, from his second apology. He won't look at this. About we'll just start at the beginning. For I myself, when I discovered the wicked disguise which the evil spirits had thrown around the divine doctrines of the Christians, to turn aside others from joining them, laughed both at those who framed these falsehoods and at the disguise itself. I confess that I both boast and with all my strength strive to be found a Christian, not because the teachings of Plato are different from those of Christ, but because they are not in all respects similar, as neither are those of the other Stoics and poets and historians. Each man spoke well in proportion to the share he had of the generative word or reason, logos, seeing what was related to it. Though they who contradict themselves on the more important points appear not to have possessed wisdom that is infallible. Whatever things were rightly said among all teachers are the property of us Christians. All of the good things that pagan teachers have taught, they get from the Logos. But what the pagan teachers didn't realize is that the real Logos, with a capital L, is God the Son, who's born as Jesus Christ. God the Word, who's born as Jesus Christ. So all of the good things that pagan teachers say are automatically Christian things, teaching you to honor your parents, teaching you not to murder, teaching you not to steal. Those are all Christian ideas that the pagan philosophers get from the Logos that is in every man. And not only does he say that, all of the things that you think are so great about pagan philosophy turn out to be also true in Christianity, but they are true because they are Christian. And so the better a pagan philosopher really is, the more Christian he is. So why not go all the way? It's first thing to notice is that Justin is looking for things that connect the non-Christian world with the Christian world, not things that separate them. Because he's trying to say, look at all the things we have that you already approve of. We are not threatening. We are not dangerous. We are not hostile to you. We are just trying to be good people. Okay, the story of Peregrinus, number 107, I included for a number of things. This is a speech by the pagan rhetorician Lucian, who was working in Antioch in Asia Minor. What's interesting about this is the picture. It's quite a long, on the passing of Peregrinus, on the death of Peregrinus. It's quite a long speech, and it makes wicked fun of Christians for being dupes and idiots. One of the things it does as a part of this is to present from the outside, by a hostile witness, how much Christians try to take care of their fellows when they are being gone after by the Roman government. It's one of the most important witnesses to the fact that Christian charity in the church actually was a living, important thing to such a degree that very hostile people were aware of it. And so, because they couldn't argue that Christians didn't try to take care of each other, they tried to argue that they were stupid to do so. And one of the examples is this guy Peregrinus, who seems to have been a shyster, who went around defrauding people all over the Roman world, the Eastern Roman world, and eventually fastened on the Christians as being particularly easy to get things out of for nothing because they were so charitable. I mean, anyone who's ever worn a clerical collar and walked down the street knows that everybody comes up to beg from you because they think, well, here's a sucker, he'll give me whatever I ask him because he has to. And that goes all the way back to the middle of the 100s at least, because here Lucian is a good. So I wanted to include that. The passing of Peregrinus is something that's worth trying to find. I think you can find it all in English on the internet. Just a few more quick things while we have only about 9 more minutes. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, here in number 108, as the note says, what's really interesting about this is Marcus Aurelius, who is a completely convinced pagan philosopher as well as an emperor, uses the stubbornness of Christians, their unwillingness to be convinced to change their minds and so willingness to die for their faith, as a sort of obvious example that everybody knows. He's as stubborn as a Christian. Which means, of course, that Christians were known by people outside the church and hostile to the church to be passionate and rooted in their faith. In other words, when Christians talk about, being willing to go to the stake, for their faith and everything, that's not just idle boasting to make them sound tough. This is also what non-Christians around them said about them. And of course, they didn't like it. Right? Marcus Aurelius doesn't approve of this, but he thinks it's certainly the case. It's one of the things that makes Christians bad. They won't stop doing it, so you have to throw them to the lions. Fronto, who was a great Latin orator and grammarian, is of course something that everybody knows. And what's interesting in this dialogue of Minucius Felix, the Octavius, which is on your list, the pagan guy says, what takes place at their banquets, about the Christians, right? What takes place at their banquets is also well known. It's everywhere talked about, right? Everybody knows that Christians are cannibals who want to have sex with your sister if you let her go over there. So we don't even have to talk about it. It's all pre-proven. This is known. That's important, first of all, to show that Christians were, of course, being talked about, but it's also important to see what kind of audience you begin with if you are a Christian apologist. You begin with a room full of, full of people who have a very decided opinion of you. Anyway, there are too many we live in Washington, D.C., and we've already been doing this election for 2 years, and it's a whole year away. But too many examples come to my mind, and they're all political, so I'll spare you all that agony. Are Christians monotheists? This is, and we've already talked about this, number 110 on the next page, 147. Look at the paragraph number 12. Contra Celsum survives complete of Origen. It's a very interesting work. You can buy it. It's in print. It's a very long apology. It's several hundred pages, 350 pages, something like that in English. But it goes through everything. It is a refutation of a particular. Celsus wrote a work against Christians, against Christianity. And Origen sat down and wrote a 350-page work against Celsus's work. So he goes right through it. So it makes it very detailed and inclusive. Just as an interesting note, When I was at Oxford, the Roman Catholic chaplaincy had a tradition of having apologetic talks every week. During term time, you could go there and hear one of the academics speak. And I went one time. Father Anthony Meredith, S.J., who was a great, still alive, thank goodness, was a great scholar of the early church and expert in the Cappadocian Fathers. And I went over one time to hear him speak. And, he was defending the faith. We all sat on the floor, and he sat in a chair. It was very English. And he said, ask me anything you want. And on his lap, he had a book. And I, being my degraded Protestant self, I assumed it was a Bible because, isn't that what you'd assume? I mean, he's a Jesuit priest. It was a copy of Henry Chadwick's translation of the Contra Celsum. It was really very interesting. And so people would ask him questions, and he'd say, let's see what Origen says. And he'd look it up in the back. There's a good index. He'd look it up in the back, and he'd read out the little passage. He would say, it would be something like this. Are Christians monotheists? Celsus says, no, they're crazed. They believe in this guy, and they believe in God. How can they say that they believe that God is one when they believe in God and this guy? And so he would look up the passage and then read it to us. And at the end, he said, the reason I've been doing this is I wanted to tell you that this is the earliest large-scale defense of Christianity that survives. It's from the middle 200s. And you should see that, I've used it. Of course, this is not a standard audience. It's, college students and grad students. He said, but it addresses questions that are still asked today. He said, what I wanted to tell you was that the task of proclaiming the gospel to the world and explaining the gospel to the world is not nearly as different now in the end of the 20th century, this was in the 80s, about 30 years ago, as people think. Not as different now as it was, from what it was back then, as people like to think. People don't change. Questions don't change. The world seems pretty much the same kind of place. And so the questions people ask are the same. Clearly that made a big impression on me because I remember it up till now. My wife has met Father Meredith. He's really a wonderful man. And she's a big fan of Father Meredith, so he has a lot of credibility in our house. Unlike, I have no credibility in our house, but if I can convince her that Father Meredith would say something, then she'll go along with that. On principle, she rejects all of my ideas, but his ideas have weight. Okay, number 11, objections to God coming down to earth. We talked about this last time. If you have a worldview, as Platonists did and Gnostics did, that spirit and matter are completely different and have no business and no ability to get together, then it makes no sense. As here Celsus says, the assertion made both by some of the Christians and by the Jews, the former saying that some God or Son of God has come down to the earth as judge of mankind, that's the Christians, right? The latter saying that he will come, the Messiah will come. He's misunderstanding the Messiah. But anyway, is most shameful, and no lengthy argument is required to refute it. It's just, a divine being can't come down to earth. It's embarrassing to suggest it. It's counter to the nature of reality. Spirit and matter don't mix. Can't mix, won't mix, don't waste my time. Right? It's very, in our culture, the problem with God the Son coming down to earth is there is no God, right? That's our culture's problem. In their culture, the problem with God the Son coming down to earth is that gods don't come down to earth because spirit doesn't mix with matter, right? Both times the incarnation is a tough sell, but it's for very different reasons in very different circumstances. Okay, same thing on the resurrection. Celsus here. These are all, these are all the same things. Look at this. Just quickly, page 147. Are Christians monotheists? No, because they believe in God and Jesus. Objections to the idea of God coming down to the earth. It's absolutely stupid, says Celsus. Slanders against the virgin. Of course she's not a virgin. She's just a woman of easy virtue trying to cover up the fact that she got herself knocked up before she got married. On the resurrection, of course people don't come back from the dead. They might be spirits or something, the way they're represented in the Iliad, but nobody's going to get their body back. It doesn't work that way. His whole picture is, going down into Hades and then getting your body back. And he has all these myths from, that he refers to, and he says, no, the whole idea is absurd. I chose those few things. We're done for now, but I chose those few things just to show you that there are two things going on. As Father Meredith said, in one way, or on one level, the questions remain the same always. The church always has to make the same points and always has to make the same explanations because people ask the same questions. On the other hand, a lot of things change quite drastically as the culture and circumstance changes. So, for example, as we saw, objections to the incarnation seem to be universal, but what the objections are seem to change very much from time to time and place to place. So the apologetic task is never over. It's always changing. This is why, just as a note, Christian theology, the need for Christian theology is continuous. Christians always need to be writing, thinking, and speaking theologically, because every age needs the gospel explained to them. Every age needs apologetics. And it's very important to see how the early church did it intelligently, so we can try to understand what the project really was and how we can make use of their example and their insights to try to succeed at our own task of apology, which continues. Thank you. I will communicate with you soon, and next week we get Irenaeus.